Welcome, everybody, on behalf of Holocaust Museum LA. My name is Michael Morgenstern, and I work with our education department at the museum. This afternoon, you have the honor and privilege of listening to Mike Wolff, a Holocaust survivor from Germany, who will share his story with you. Before we begin, I would like to share a few words about the museum. Our museum was founded in the early 1960s by a group of Holocaust survivors who met each other in Los Angeles and decided they needed to create a memorial space for their loved ones who perished in the Holocaust. In the early 1960s, the Holocaust had only ended about 15 years earlier, and most people were, by and large, not yet ready to face this tragic history. Thanks to the courage and foresight of this group of survivors who met in Los Angeles, we have a museum that was the first Holocaust survivor founded Holocaust museum in the United States. Our mission has always been to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. And we do this today by having Holocaust survivors speak and share their stories on a regular basis. And we're so honored to have Mike Wolff with us today, who will share his story. And he is actually sharing his story for the first time through our museum. He has spoken elsewhere over the years, but this is his first time sharing his story at our museum, and he is joining us from Santa Barbara, where he lives. Again, afterwards, you can use the Q&A box to type in questions. Mike, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And you may begin.
Can we share the screen? Mike, can we share the screen?
Yes. Oh, do you, if you...
I have a PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, yes, so if you share the screen...
Do a co-host with me.
Oh, sure, okay. Actually, Harmony, can you please make Mike a co-host? Although I think as a panelist, you're able to.
She had me as a co-host before.
Okay, I think it should work. Are you not able to share screen?
I'll try.
Yeah, as a panelist, you should be able to.
Okay. Okay, we got it?
Yes, it's working. We can see it, thank you.
I'd like to apologize up front. This presentation is meant for kids, mainly 5th through 12th grade, so it may be a little overbearing for some of you people. I'm sure you know all this. Anyway, my name is Mike Wolff. I was born in June of 1936 in Breslau, Germany. The Kindertransport actually started at Kristallnacht. What the Kristallnacht triggered, both in the United States and in Great Britain, is activity that would promote the allowance of the kids to go into the country to receive the kids. In the United States, a bill was proposed in Congress to bring in 20,000 kids into this country. Unfortunately, it never went anywhere. There was too much isolationism going on, and in the end, only about 1,000 kids made it to the United States, on the auspices of private people mainly. In Great Britain, there was a totally different story. Several Bishop of Canterbury, the Jewish organizations, and within 3 weeks, they managed to get a law passed, and the first transport actually hit the shores of Great Britain on December 2nd, 1938. It was a group of approximately 170 kids from a orphanage in Berlin that had been burned out by the Nazis on Kristallnacht. It's almost impossible to believe that in that short a period they managed to arrange for places for the kids to go to get the kids together and get them over there. But that's when the Kindertransport officially started. My story really starts in February of 1939, where my mother's best friend sent her little daughter Eva to a family in Scotland, in Glasgow, Scotland. The sister of the lady who adopted this little girl, Eva, wanted a little boy. So she worked backwards through the system, and the request actually landed in Berlin on the desk of my aunt, my mother's sister, who saw this request and called my mother and told her, you should send Michael over to this family. So in June of 1939, 2 weeks before my 3rd birthday, my mother took me to Berlin, and we joined the Kindertransport. I was the youngest of about 168 kids, and we went from Berlin to Hamburg. Because I was the youngest, my mother was actually allowed on the train to accompany me to Hamburg, where she handed me over to one of the older girls and told her to please take care of my child. Now, about a year ago, I went on Facebook and posted my story, and a gentleman by the name of George Fogelson contacted me, and he says, my mother and my 2 aunts were on the same transport that you were on, and my aunt was actually handed a child. It may have been me, but we don't know for sure because his aunt passed away. But anyway, my mother handed me over, and I went over to London, and she went back to Reichenbach, to her home. When we got to London, we landed in the Liverpool station where all the Kindertransports came together. Every kid had a little tag about this big and with a number on it, so they could find the parties that they were looking for. The family that adopted me are Mr. and Mrs. Ness. They lived in Glasgow. They had a daughter, Anita, who was about 6 years old at the time. And Mr. Ness came to London to pick me up. My mother had also arranged for a friend of hers, a Mrs. Elsa Weiss, to meet me. I met Mrs. Weiss in the 1990s in Orange County, and she told me that I was hanging on to her for dear life because she was the only person that could speak German and I couldn't understand any English. But eventually Mr. Ness got me away from her, and we went up to Glasgow, where I was supposed to stay there for the duration. My mother, of course, went back to Reichenbach, to her home, where she was going to take care of our family business. My father was one of 6 kids, and he was the youngest of the family. And my grandfather believed very much in educating his children, but by the time my dad got out of something like junior college, my grandfather was up in age, and he decided to set him up in business, so he bought a half interest in a sawmill. So my mother is running the sawmill. She's trying to get my dad out of jail at the same time because he was arrested on Kristallnacht, like most Jewish men were. And she's also taking care of her father, who lived with us at the time because he had a small gift household store that, of course, he had to sell because the stormtroopers stood in front of it and wouldn't allow people to go in because this is a Jewish store. Eventually, my mother managed to get my dad out of prison, and he came over to Great Britain to join me. And This was in August of 1938. And then my mother went to all the different embassies trying to get a visa anywhere in the world. The only place she was able to obtain a visa turned out to be Bolivia, South America. So in January of 1940, my mother left through Holland and crossed the Atlantic. The interesting part of the story is my parents were able to communicate with each other through the Red Cross, or through different Jewish agencies. My father wanted my mother to go out through Italy because she coming out of Holland, he felt were being torpedoed. As luck would have it, she could not arrange transportation to Italy, so she went out of Holland. And the ship that she would have taken out of Italy was actually torpedoed, but her ship made it through, and she ended up in La Paz, Bolivia, with about maybe $10 in her pocket, and she knew exactly two people in the country. One of her schoolmates from Germany was there with her brother. So my mother is starting a new life in Bolivia. Before they left Germany, before my father was arrested, he had arranged to build 12 boxes at the sawmill, about the size of a standard desk, where my mother packed all the household goods into these boxes and shipped them to Bolivia. She actually received one box. So she was in a room with a straw mattress that somebody gave her that was full of lice. And she said the box was her table. She had a lamp and a hot plate. And that's how she started her life in Bolivia. Eventually, she was able to get a job as a secretary to a Jewish lawyer whose partner happened to be a state senator. By this time, Bolivia had also closed its borders to any immigrants. So through this connection, my mother managed to get visas for my father and I to enter Bolivia. So she sent a cablegram to my father in Great Britain, telling him to get to London somehow and get to the Bolivian embassy to pick up the visas. Now, my father was in England, in Great Britain, and he was not allowed to roam the country freely. Great Britain had just come out of a depression, and they didn't want the foreigners to take the few jobs that were available for the locals. I've marked the map, and those are the places where my father was moved to in that order. I don't understand, and I don't quite understand why they kept moving him, but they kept moving him from, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4. 3 is kind of an estimate. We couldn't really find it. That's, he was only there for just a little under a year and a half, but that's where they kept moving him. But somehow they, my father did get the information from my mother and tried to get to London at that visa. Now these are excerpts from my father's log. He kept the log in his prayer book, and he came to visit me up in Glasgow in January. And of course, by then I only spoke English, and I didn't recognize him. And he was of course, totally devastated that had happened. But as you can see, on April 5th, he says, I received a telegram that I should go to the consulate to get the visas. And on June, he planned to depart Liverpool as early as June, but it didn't work out because he was not released on time. So he went back. We tried it again in July, and we were supposed to sail, and we were sailing out of Liverpool. Mr. Ness would bring me down to Liverpool, and my father would meet us. But as you can see, the first time, he did not get released in time, so we missed the boat. The second time, his papers were out of order, so they actually arrested him. And every time I went back, to Glasgow with Mr. Ness, and he went to the different places. Now, in September, they said the papers were lost. In November, he got new papers. And then in December 22nd, I arrived in Liverpool. Lucky Star saved Mr. Ness and Michael from the bombardment. We were there during air raid. I remember the air raid because I remember going into a bunker, or maybe it was the underground, and coming out and walking glass because the windows of the hotel had been shattered and the glass was all over the floor. We sailed on December 26th, returned to Liverpool to miss the convoy, and finally on December 31st, we sailed from Liverpool. I remember the crossing. We were on a cargo ship, and I remember the guns in the back of the ship going off, the one gun, I guess I should say, periodically, and we were always at our live stations, and the ships around us were always firing. Presumably there were U-boats, but we did actually make it across safely. At least it was safe. And my mother, of course, had sent the visa in April to London. And between April is what is now, let me see what the date, January 1940, she had no, 1941, she had no idea where we were. So my father, for some reason, contacted Mr. Ness and had him send a telegram to my mother telling him that it says, Michael and father sailed and now in safe place, meaning we've crossed the Atlantic and we were out of the danger of the U-boat zones. And then, of course, after landing in the Caribbean, we eventually went through the Panama Canal and got to La Paz, Bolivia, where I met this strange woman who was my birth mother, who, of course, I recognize. As I said before, my father did not have any formal training, so he had a hard time finding a job in Libya. And, he had probably about $5 in his pocket. So, we lived in a one-room place. And eventually, my father was able to get a job with a American mining company in the town of Potosi, which is about 12,000 feet up in the Andes. So we moved to Potosi, and he became a miner. He worked in the mine. But we lived with friends of my mother's for a couple of weeks, and then eventually we were able to get our own apartment. And this was actually our first apartment in Potosi. We had one room we had one room, and I shared the room with my parents. We had a one bedroom. We had a dining room, which had basically a table and a hutch, and we had a kitchen with a wood burning stove and water that came out of a tank, but we did not have a bathroom. The bathroom was across the patio on the far side. This is the bathroom here. And so if we got to go to the bathroom, we had to cross the patio, and we shared the bathroom with 3 other families from the apartment house. I have to manually because the clicker isn't working. So when we went to the bathroom, this is how we did it. I had a board to sit on. We had a bucket to flush because it wasn't running water, toilet paper, candle, and matches, and we dropped over to the bathroom. And I said did have, but to take it, we had a big tub in the middle of the kitchen, And once a week, we filled the tub with hot water and we took a bath. That was the way we lived. Now, my parents' goal was always to come to the States. So as soon as they sort of got settled in Potosi, my parents applied for visas to come to the States. My father was born in Germany, but the town that he was born in became Polish after World War I, so he was deemed to be on a Polish quota, and it took us 10 years for his papers to come through. So we lived in Bolivia for about 11 years. Now, while in Bolivia, my parents and the Nesses corresponded on a regular basis. The Nesses, of course, were interested in how I was doing and what we were doing. So they corresponded on a regular basis and kept in touch that way. In 1952, the visas for all of us came through, and we left Bolivia. We went to the Panama Canal again, and then flew into Memphis, Tennessee. Why Memphis, Tennessee? Is because my mother had a cousin there, and you had to have a guarantee so that you wouldn't go on unemployment. They guaranteed that we would not. So we ended up in Memphis. Now, when we got to Memphis, Mr. and Mrs. Ness were coming to New York, and they wanted to meet. They wanted my parents to bring me to New York. Well, my mother was a bookkeeper, and my father, of course, was just a general laborer. They both just started new jobs. My mother was working for a furniture company. My mother was working for a junkyard in Memphis, and they just started new jobs, and they really couldn't afford the trip. So they declined, and the Nesses got very upset. So correspondence between the Ness family and my parents stopped. But I still corresponded with them. I started writing them a couple, 3 times a year. A year later, my father had terrible arthritis, and the weather just didn't agree with him, and he really couldn't get a decent job. We moved to San Francisco, California, where my mother had another cousin, and I've been pretty much in California ever since. So we were in California, and I went to school at Berkeley, graduated from Berkeley, and went to work for 3 months for Pacific Gas and Electric Company in Pittsburgh, California. And then 3 months later, I got drafted and got into the Army. I also got married, got drafted in that order, and we ended up in Utah for 2 years. And then eventually, when I was discharged, we moved to Orange County to Anaheim, and I kept in touch with the Nesses the whole time. Fast forward to 1970, I applied for a job in Santa Barbara, and I moved to Santa Barbara to work for Burroughs Corporation. And during the move, my correspondence, my letters from the Nesses, the package that I had got lost, and so I couldn't correspond with them, and eventually lost total touch with the Nesses. Fast forward to 1993. I have a group of friends. There's anywhere from 5 to 10 of us. We go out to lunch every weekday of the whole year entirely. And in early 1993, one of my friends, the dentist, brought his last patient, a fellow by the name of Bob Rifkin, to lunch with him. Bob is married to a gal from Scotland. They're Orthodox Jews. And Bob made the comment to me, I'm so glad that Mishpoche went back to Scotland. You know, after they had a bar mitzvah, the bar mitzvah's over and the Mishpoche went back to Scotland. And I said, where in Scotland? And he says, Glasgow. So I told him my story, and I said, next time your aunt I'm sorry, your wife talks to her aunt, please ask her to find out if she can trace the name of the Ness girl, Anita Ness, the daughter of the people that took me in. This was on a Monday. It was at the Carol's restaurant here in Goleta. The following Sunday, Bob calls me. He says, I have a phone number for you. It was 8 o'clock at night, so of course I couldn't call. 5:30 Monday morning, the phone rings. It's Anita. She says, why haven't you contacted me? I said, because I knew you had gotten married and I lost the letters and I couldn't remember your last name. So 50 years later, we reestablished contact. I reestablished contact with me that took me in. In September of 1993, my wife Lonnie and I, we went to Great Britain. We'd arranged that we would stay with her when we got to Glasgow, but we went to London first, and we met Richard, her son, there, and he invited us to his house. And we met Richard's wife and the two kids, and we had dinner with them. And then we took the train to Glasgow, and Anita was a very, very nervous person, insisted that we stay with her. And then she kind of had second thoughts, but once we got to know each other, things settled down pretty well. And, we got along very well. And the second day that we were there, that evening, she had her cousins, about 15 of them, come over to meet me. They were all older than I am, and they all, of course, remembered me. I did not remember them. And I was told, what kind of a brat I had been, how I got away with murder, and everything I did, poor Anita took the blame for it. The thing that I didn't realize was when I left, Mrs. Ness lost her son. The Nesses wanted to adopt a child. And of course, my parents' idea was never to let me out for adoption. They only wanted safekeeping for me for the duration should they survive. And since they both survived, of course, I went back to join them. And Mr. Ness actually tried to bribe my father into letting me stay with them. Of course, my father, there was nothing, he wouldn't think about that. So that really hurt me. I never thought about it. It never occurred to me that happened. Mrs. Ness actually didn't go to her bedroom for almost 3 months. That's how bad it was. I felt bad about it. I did, however, realize I remembered some of the things about the house. And I remembered the street, and at the end of the street, there was a little hill with a railroad track there, and I remember trains passing there. I also vaguely remembered there was a bunker in the backyard that we used to during a couple of air raids that they did on Glasgow, because there was a shipbuilding facility there. I remembered Mr. Ness. Mr. Ness tied the tefillin on his arm and did his prayers every morning, and I took my wooden blocks and tied them to my arm and kind of mimicked him. I remember that very clearly. I did not have a memory of Mrs. Ness for some reason. I just couldn't. So they visited very well. And in January of 1994, and I forgot to mention also that Eva, the little girl that went ahead of me to Glasgow, actually was one of the cousins that came to that party. Her parents did not survive the Holocaust, so she still lives in Scotland, in Glasgow today. And in 1994, Anita and Eva actually came to visit us here in Santa Barbara. Anita hates to fly. She's scared to death of flying, but she finally, because Eva came with her, and the girls came. We went to San Francisco, went to Vegas, and then we went to Orange County, where my mother lived, and my mother got to meet Anita and Eva. My mother never liked to talk about this. It was way too painful for her. I mean, you can imagine what it was like to give up a 3-year-old son, not knowing whether you would ever see him again. So for her, it was very painful. So she didn't like to talk to her. But I finally pulled my mother aside and, asked her to talk to Eva because she was the only living person who knew Eva's birth parents. And she had an album with pictures and they went over that. So that went over pretty well. And in August of 2010, Lonnie and I and two of my grandkids, Mikey and Amanda, we went over to London. We rented 2 flats, and the kids stayed in one flat and we stayed in the other one. They were adjoining flats. And Anita actually came down and we had nice visits. Both of Anita's kids, her daughter Leonie and her son Richard, live in London. And we met with all of them, and it was a great reunion. This is a picture of my father's family. My grandfather was a medical doctor. The little guy standing in the stool is the youngest, and that was my dad. The 6 kids all survived. We found out my grandfather passed away in the mid-20s, so he was out of the picture. My grandmother, we found out that she actually died in 1942 in a Jewish hospital in Berlin. I found that out just recently. My aunt was in Great Britain. One of my uncles was in Argentina, and the rest of them were in what was then Palestine, now Israel. So they all managed to survive. This is my mother's family. My grandfather, my mother, her sister, and my father. My mother, when she left for Bolivia, wanted her sister and her father to come with her, but they wouldn't leave Germany. My grandfather says, I fought for World War I, they're not going to do anything to me. He actually was in a ghetto in Theresienstadt and passed away sometime, we don't know when. My aunt was gassed in Auschwitz. One of the things I remember very clearly is the day the war was over in Europe in 1945. We were in Potosi, Bolivia, and there was a bachelor's quarters of a lot of the German Jews that were working in the mine, and they had a big party, and my mother got slightly tipsy, and as we were walking home that evening, my mother says, the first thing tomorrow, I'm going to contact the Red Cross to find out what happened to my sister and my father. It was 1945. We got the Red Cross answered us in 1992, and that's where we got the information that my aunt was gassed in Auschwitz in 1943, and my grandfather passed away in Theresienstadt. It took that long to get that information. This I used to be cute. This is me in Germany with the typical lederhosen. It was one of the pictures I had from Germany. This is me right here, the little guy. In the Liverpool station in London, when I arrived on the Kindertransport, the lady is probably a social worker that's trying to figure out, which kids belong to where, but that's a picture that Mrs. Weiss actually took. This is my father and my mother, and this is our second house in Potosi. Once my father got promoted out of the mine into an office job, we were eligible for company housing a little bit to the apartment we had. And this was my great buddy, Jackie, my dog. When we left the house for the last time to come to the States, as we were driving down the street, I turned around and poor Jackie was chasing the car, and I have that image in my head, and I'll never get it out of it. This is the reunion, and I then at the Glasgow train station when we met in 1993. And this is also Anita and her son Richard and his girlfriend, and my wife Lonnie and I in London when the last trip that we took with the grandkids. And this is Anita. This is her daughter and Anita's grandson, my granddaughter and my grandson when we were in London on the same trip. This is a statue at the Liverpool station. It's right outside the Liverpool station. It's to commemorate the Kindertransport, and it's a great statue. I went there when I was there with my grandkids, and it took us almost a half an hour to find it because we asked several people if they knew about it. Nobody had any idea what I was talking about, but we finally managed to find it. This is the back of the statue, and for some reason, my little town of Breslau, my birth town, is right there. Several people were the feet of a couple of guys that were sitting, leaning against the statue and having ice cream. And I asked them if they knew what it was about. Of course, they had no idea. Just before we left, I saw a lady taking a picture of the statue. And I asked the lady, I says, "Do you know what it is?" And she says, "Yeah, it's about the kids during the war." And I told her, I says, "I was one of those kids." And she started crying, thank me. And I told her, "No, I need to thank you. You were the only country in really cared about us and took us in." This is the prayer book that I was talking about. I said my kept a log. It's a little prayer book. Here's the actual prayer book. And this is where he kept this log, and on the blank pages of the prayer book, it's written in German, and I can't read German, so I had it translated. But this is where he kept pretty much of a log of his travels and what was happening, and that's how I got most of my story. That's how I was able to put this together. That and a few things that I could pull out of my mother, because, like I said, she didn't she didn't like to talk about it. I have to give my wife credit. She talked my mom eventually into doing a Spielberg tape. So my mother put her on the tape, and when the tape came, she wouldn't even look at it. She just handed it to me. But she finally was able to do it, and thank you to Lonnie, that she managed to do that. And that is basically my story. So if you got any questions or not.
Thank you so much for sharing
Sure.
your story with us. We do have a few questions. First, do you remember being on the train with your mother?
No, I don't remember anything about Germany. I have no recollection at all. The first recollection I have is of Scotland and being in the Ness home. I was not quite 3 when I left Germany. It was 2 weeks before my 3rd birthday. My mother actually tells a story that she was allowed to go with me on the train, and they stopped the train because they had an extra head count. And once they figured out that she wasn't going on the ship, they let the train go. So she was on the train with me, definitely. but I have no recollection. I have met a lot of fellow, kinder transport kids at the different conventions, and a lot of them, I think that the sense I got from them, the older ones kind of knew what was going on. For the younger ones, they were told they were going on vacation and the parents would follow. I think most of the parents knew that they'd never see their kids again. It had to be just awful for the parents. You just can't imagine what they went through. I know my mother was devastated when she turned me over in Hamburg to one of the older girls. I know she was very traumatized.
Thank you for sharing. What languages do you speak today?
I speak German fairly well. I got a problem with Spanish. I don't know. I got a mental block on Spanish. I can still understand it pretty well, and I can speak some of it, but I'm forgetting words. I'm losing words. I'm losing words in English too, but not like Spanish. But I still remember Spanish, and I never learned to read or write German. We spoke German at home, and I can still understand it pretty well.
When you say you spoke German at home, does this mean with your
In
parents
Bolivia.
after, throughout the rest of their lives, you would communicate with them in German? Or
Well, we communicated in Germany, in Bolivia. Once we got to the States, it became mainly English. And once I got married, because Lonnie didn't understand German and the kids came around, it was mainly English. But while we were in Bolivia, it was pretty much German. There were some strange things that happened in Bolivia that I don't normally hit on, but my mother had a small coffee shop, if you will. It was, she served sandwiches. My mother was a good baker. She was a terrible cook, but a good baker. And she used to bake goodies, and she made sandwiches. And she had two types of clienteles. She had the German Jews, and she had the local miners. We were kind of on the way of the miners going to the mine, so they would stop and buy sandwiches. Well, my mother had some Camembert cheese that she used for the, for the gringos, for the foreigners, and by mistake, she put some of it in one of the miners' sandwiches. So my mother got arrested because she was selling rotten food. So my dad came home and got me, and we had to go to police headquarters to bail my mother out, for selling rotten food. But those are the little nuances that went on in Bolivia, the strange things.
was there two questions. Was there a German Jewish community in Bolivia? And were there also Nazis in Bolivia, to your knowledge?
Both. Actually, they were, I consider it three sects. That there were the Nazis were there, the German Jews were there, we called them the Yekas, and the Polish Jews were there. And there were, the Polish Jews, the only time we got together there was only one synagogue in Potosi. And it happened to be on top of a rubber vulcanizing store. And you can imagine it was summertime for Yom Kippur, and the heat and the smell were awful. And most of the majority were Polish Jews, and they ran the services. And by 3 o'clock, we were usually 2 hours behind in the services. And my father could read Hebrew like no one I've ever met. So at 3 o'clock, my father would be called up to the bima, and he would start leading the service. And in about an hour and a half, we were caught up. That's how fast he read. And then we went back to the old Polish way of praying. But there were definitely three sects there. it was interesting to watch, people would, survivors would come into Potosi, and the community would help them get it started. Like a couple of the several of the Polish people owned dry goods stores. Yeah, they were selling yardage, and they would, the guy would start out with 2 suitcases and an Indian carrying the suitcases, and they would walk around door to door selling yardage, selling fabrics, and eventually would have 3 guys, 3 Indians following him. Then eventually would have a store. It was kind of interesting to follow. Most of the German Jews worked in the mine, worked for Hochschild. My father started out as a miner working inside the mine, and then his arthritis started up. So they gave him an office job, and he eventually became office manager. And that's when we got a little bit better housing, and we got out of that little apartment that we had in downtown Bolivia, where we didn't even have running water.
Thank you very much. You mentioned the term Yekes. What does that mean?
They use it as German Jews are called Yekes. I sort of find the term a little bit derogatory, but that's what they call them. They call them, we used to call us the Yekes. As a matter of fact, if you go on Facebook, there's a whole pot full of Yekes. There's a Yekes association, actually, made up of German Jews or descendants of German Jews now.
Thank you. You talked a little bit about your father's family. Can you share with us what you know of your parents' backgrounds? Did they ever talk about their childhoods with you? And what do you know about their lives before you were born?
My grandfather was a medical doctor, and they were Orthodox. And like I said, he was very interested in having his children educated. The eldest was my aunt. She became a nurse. The second one became a doctor. One became a watchmaker. I'm not sure about the other 2. Now, I know that my father's favorite cousin married outside the religion, and they said Shiva for her. And my father, that was the end of Orthodoxy for my father. He had actually almost considered becoming a rabbi, but as soon as they did that, he says, "That's it for me. They're all crazy." So he had a pretty normal childhood, from what I can detect. He just the problem was that he was the youngest, and like I said, by the time my grandfather, by the time he got out of school, my grandfather was old. He just set him up in business, so he didn't have any formal training. My mother's father ran a store. I call it a variety store. They said they sold, maybe it was a small hardware store. It's kind of, I don't know, an old corner store. And my grandmother, her mother passed away when my mother was 13. She had cancer. So my mother worked in the store, helped out at home, and she and my aunt and her sister. There were only 2 of them, and she seemed to have a pretty. She talked about going on vacation with her cousins, and going swimming in the lakes, and pretty normal childhood till 1933, when the stormtroopers started standing in front of the store discouraging people from coming in. That's why he had my grandfather had to sell the store, and eventually moved in with my parents. But they seemed to be pretty normal. Now, a lot of my mother had a lot of cousins, a ton of cousins. I haven't done any research on her family, but she had cousins all over the world. I don't know if some of the people are familiar, but there was a publication called the Aufbau. which means rebuilding. It came out of New York, and they used it extensively in Bolivia. In the classified, you would put ads in. You know, Arnold and Elsa Wolff from Reichenbach are now living in Potosi, Bolivia at the 24 Tarija. And that's how they, my cousin in South Africa, you know, several in South America and in Europe. And that's how they managed to get to reunite. The other side of the family, the Wolff family, they're terrible. And, you know, my uncle lived in Argentina, and they hardly corresponded. You know, lived in Buenos Aires, and very seldom heard from them. When Lonnie and I retired in 2000, I wanted to get a reunion of my cousins. There's 12 of us. In my generation, my father was the youngest, but I'm the oldest of that generation. And I called. My mother gave me all the addresses, and she says you'll get one response, and that's exactly what I got. And even today, I get emails from one of my cousins' husbands, and I am in touch with one cousin in Sweden and in Switzerland, but they're just terrible communicating. They just don't communicate.
Thank you for sharing. On the subject of relatives, extended family, do you remember as a child when you reunited with your parents, do you remember them talking about looking for relatives? And at what point do you remember they realized what happened to those who didn't survive?
I honestly don't know at what point. They were very close mouth. Very seldom. We never talked about it. You know, it was very seldom that they would mention anything. I know they were looking for I know the ads of the Aufbau, and they corresponded with several people, but it just wasn't talked about. As a matter, you know, as a matter of fact, well, I mentioned the fact when Eva came, my mother wouldn't hardly talk to her. I finally had to corner my mother and ask her to talk about it. She did not like talking about it. It was too difficult for her. I don't know when they found out. I wasn't aware of when they found out what had really happened. You know, the crematorium and all that. I don't know about that. I was too young to probably even understand it. If it was, you know, I was 10 years old. You know, it wasn't made public to me. It wasn't mentioned, and you know, we didn't have we had a newspaper, but we didn't get it. We couldn't afford it. We were pretty poor in Bolivia. You know, they eventually managed to build up their, you know, to build themselves up, but we were pretty poor.
Thank you. So that was another question as well that you you pretty much answered. So you never talked with your parents about these experiences?
Yeah. Once in a while, yeah, my mother typed up very, very late in life. She typed up a little bit of her story, and she finally typed up, and I picked up some things. And of course, my father, I had this translated when I was in Santa Barbara. When we were in the last time we were in Great Britain with my grandson, my grandson Mikey, he says, if you don't write your story, I will. And I should have probably let him write it, but I did write my story. My full story is, I published a book, what was it, about 5-6 years ago. It's called Full Circle, and it's available on Amazon if anybody's interested. It's Full Circle by me, and but generally speaking, we did not talk about it. It just wasn't mentioned. Even with you know, we had the typical Sunday afternoon coffee and cake with in Bolivia. That was even in San Francisco. They get together Sunday afternoon for coffee and cake. That was common, but very seldom talked about it. Several in San Francisco, of course, my mother had a first cousin and a couple of second cousins, but us kids, we usually went our own way, and the adults stayed in a different room. But very seldom talked about it, and even I never talked about it till I don't know if you're aware. I should mention it in Santa Barbara at the Jewish Federation. They have the Portraits of Survival. A lady here, and I can't pull up her name right now, went to Montreal, and apparently the Jewish Federation there has also a room called the Portraits of Survival, where the stories of survivors are in big plaques and on display. And the Federation here decided to do that. And they asked for people, the survivors, to put their stories up, and I included mine. And that's what started, that's what started bringing in kids from the local schools. Like I said, mainly 5th through 12th grades. We bring in kids from Carpinteria and from the local schools here in Santa Barbara. They bring them in, and they go through the portraits, and then we present our stories. Usually there's one or two of us talking to the kids. Of course, this last year, due to COVID, that came to a screeching halt. But I figure I've talked to somewhere around 5,000 kids, and we do this through the portraits. And that's when I really started looking into this thing and started talking about it. That's about maybe 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, something like that. The time flies by, and I don't have an exact feeling for time anymore. But that's what started this thing. And there's a gentleman that was in an underground bunker through the war. He speaks. We had a lady that came out of the Warsaw Ghetto. She's the only survivor of a family of about eight kids, and the parents and all her uncles and relatives were killed. She's the only one that came out of the ghetto just by accident. And we have a lady that was born in France that went through, several towns and several hiding places, and we speak to the kids, and that's how we got started talking.
Since you did not speak about these experiences for so long, how did it feel to start talking about it and sharing your story with people?
Uh, it's difficult sometimes. Sometimes when I think about what happened to Mrs. Ness, and and what my parents went through, it's sometimes it's hard. Other times it's not so bad. But yeah, you get used to it eventually. I my granddaughter, the one that was with me in London, teaches in Santa Ana. She teaches in a barrio basically, and they study the Holocaust. And the first time she asked me to come to speak to her school, and I agreed. And the first time I went, she says, "You're going to talk to 5 classes." I says, "Oh gosh, but I managed it." And I go back pretty much every year. And as a matter of fact, a week from next Tuesday, I'm going to do a Zoom class with her class. But sometimes it bothers me. Other times it doesn't. It just depends. Sometimes it's hard when I talk about Anita. Anita passed away about 2.5 years ago, roughly. We lost Anita. She went downhill pretty fast, and I was calling her, and finally her son Richard says that don't call her. She really doesn't know who you are anymore, and we lost her. Now I didn't mention that my son and my daughter both went back to Great Britain a couple years ago, just before COVID, actually. And my son went to London and met Richard, and they're in touch with each other. That's Anita's son. And my daughter actually went to Glasgow, and she took her son with my grandson with her, and they stood in front of the house and had their picture taken, and they met with Anita's granddaughter, who still lives in Glasgow. She's a lawyer in Glasgow, and they met, and they're in touch. And then she went to London and met both of the Anita's kids. So the circle is still there, which I'm happy to say.
Thank you. As a concluding question, why do you share your story, and what would you like the audience to take away from learning your story this afternoon?
Well, we certainly like the history not to repeat itself. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen. But I'd like the people to be informed of what happened, and I'd like them to know. And what I really would like is not so much for the adults. I would like them to pass the story on to their kids, grandkids. Yeah, that they'd know what happened. And I'm actually I'm not scared. I'm actually terrified of what's going on in this country. What happened? What started with a lie? The Jews are responsible for all our problems by Mr. Hitler, and look what's happening here now. We start with a lie, and it gets spread, and it divides people, it upsets people, and it bothers me. It was interesting. There was an interesting note at one of the Kindertransports a few years ago. Several of the kinder had dual citizenship, German and U.S. And I was kind of surprised, and I asked them why, and they said, if things go south here, we want to go, we'll go back. Of course, now most of them I'm one of the younger ones that are too old to travel, but just the thought that was in their heads. They never really got over the fear that how quickly things went bad in Germany, and hopefully things won't go bad here. But I'm not happy with the direction we're heading. So beware of lies. To think about what can happen when somebody starts a lie. The old saw: if you tell a lie often enough, people will start believing it. And look what's happening. History repeats itself. So hopefully it won't get bad.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us this afternoon. We're so happy that we connected with you, and that you're able to do this. And I know the distance between Santa Barbara and Los Angeles, Zoom makes it so easy. So we're so happy and honored to have had you with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Of course, and we would certainly love to invite you to speak to students moving forward. Thank you again, everybody, for listening and for your questions. We hope to welcome everyone to the museum in person when we open. In the meantime, please follow our website to see our programs. We have regular virtual programs, which will be continuing as well, even after we open in person. But we thank you so much again for sharing your story with us. Wishing everybody a happy, healthy, and safe weekend. And again, we hope to see everybody soon in
Thank you.
our next program. Thank you so much.